London, 3005. The city awoke not with the calm chirping of birds, but the creak of gallows and the stench of purpose. In the bowels of Smithfield, where plague carts once roamed and thieves wept into straw, a scaffold stood like a monument to hatred. It was no ordinary morning, and no ordinary man was to die. The air was wet with August mist, but beneath the fog, a crowd thickened. Not just peasants with sour breath and cracked heels, but nobles with gloved hands and veiled disdain. Children sat on shoulders. Old women whispered the name like a spell. Wallace. To the English he was a beast, untamed, defiant, a brute who dared to strike at the spine of empire. To the Scots who slipped quietly through the crowd, he was a saint in chains. The wooden platform groaned beneath the weight of blood, still crusted from yesterday's hangings. But today would be different. The scaffold had been rebuilt, reinforced. Not for efficiency, but endurance. Every nail, every beam was designed not to kill quickly, but to prolong the suffering, to craft a memory, to make pain echo through generations. Then came the sound, wooden wheels grinding over cobbled stone, a flat cart, more coffin than carriage, dragged by blackened horses. On it lay the shape of a man, barely human in form, swaddled in iron shackles, William Wallace. His body, once vast and fearsome, was gaunt now, starved into surrender. Filth caked his flesh, one eye swollen shut. Yet something unbearable glowed behind the other. Not fury, not fear, something colder, eternal. Women wept openly. A man beside them cursed under his breath, but most in the crowd were silent. Not from pity, but anticipation. This was to be a reckoning, a theater of imperial triumph. Wallace was the villain in their pageant, and the execution, the grand finale. He was yanked upright, each chain a cruel marionette string. His legs buckled. The crowd leaned in. Then came the scream. Not from Wallace, but from the walls themselves. It was the collective howl of every stone in London, every soul who knew what injustice looked like, but dared not name it. It was the scream of empire, devouring what it feared most, a man unowned, and he had not even begun to die. The scream fades, replaced by memory, a colder battlefield carved into the soul. Falkirk, 12th. Mist clung to the Scottish Highlands like a burial shroud. The clash of metal and thunder of hooves tore the silence apart. William Wallace, astride a sweating mare, surveyed the chaos with eyes that burned. Not with rage, but desperate calculation. This was not a war of swords, it was a war of betrayal. The English forces, vast and disciplined, moved like a tide. Their arrows blotted the sun, and from the Scottish flanks came the sting of treachery. Wallace turned, heart sickening, as the lords of the Bruce and Common factions withdrew. Men he had trusted, allies bought with titles and gold. They abandoned him, left his men exposed, left Scotland exposed. His own soldiers screamed in confusion, holding their ground as best they could, forming schiltrons like thorny shields. But spears snapped like twigs beneath cavalry. Blood churned the earth. Bagpipes fell silent beneath English hooves. Wallace's voice, once thunder across glens, now cracked with futility. Hold! Hold! But there was nothing left to hold. Not hope, not unity, not even hatred. Only the cold whisper of defeat curling around his throat like a noose. When he finally fled the field against instinct, against pride, it was not cowardice that drove him. It was clarity. Falkirk had not been lost on the battlefield. It had been lost in the bedchambers of kings, in whispered promises made to English thrones. For years, Wallace became a shadow. Hunted, betrayed again and again. He moved through forests like a ghost, body growing leaner, spirit heavier. He watched as Robert the Bruce pledged fealty to Edward. Edward, the tyrant butcher of Scotland. It was not just betrayal of him, but of every slain villager, every burned chapel. Eventually, betrayal came not by sword, but by silver. A Scottish knight, Sir John de Menteith, handed him to the English. A friend turned Judas. Wallace's capture was not a battle, not a siege. It was a quiet betrayal in a cold glen, sealed with silence. When they chained him, he did not cry out. But something in him broke, not the rebel, not the warrior, but the believer. As they dragged him toward London, his heart was no longer whole. It carried a wound no English blade could match, a wound carved by those he had bled for. In his silence, there was thunder. The Tower of London rose like a fang against the sky, stone-cold, indifferent, immortal. Within its belly, where light perished and hope suffocated, William Wallace was entombed. They did not keep him in chains for restraint, but for ritual. Iron cuffed his wrists, ankles, throat. Rust bit into skin. Each movement tore open old wounds. They called it custody. It was desecration. No sunlight reached his cell, just a single slat above, where shadows stretched like claws. Rats skittered across his chest at night, drawn to the blood and sweat. He did not swat them. They at least were honest predators. Days passed, or maybe weeks. Time fractured. The only rhythm was the scrape of keys and the mocking voice of the jailer. "Freedom, is it?" The man would laugh, tossing stale bread near the filth bucket. "Ask your rats if they've found it yet." The cell stank of mold, iron, urine, and fading life. Yet Wallace's eyes remained unbroken, glassy at times, lost in thoughts too heavy for language, but never pleading. He dreamed not of escape, but of clarity, of the face of Marion, the wife they strangled before his rebellion began. Her hair like wheat, her throat crushed for daring to wed a rebel soul. Sometimes, in that damp void, he saw her. She stood barefoot in the shadowed corner, silent, waiting. Other times he saw Falkirk again. Not the screams, but the silence afterward. His men scattered like leaves, the noble banners retreating, his horse foaming at the mouth. He whispered once, "I was never fighting England, I was fighting rot." The guards rarely spoke in full words. They called him animal, Scot dog, traitor, but there was unease in their voices. Some refused to meet his eye. One crossed himself before locking the door, as if Wallace carried plague, or perhaps a kind of holiness that frightened them more than death. He was denied priest, parchment, pen. They feared what he might write. What was left of his body began to eat itself. Ribs pressed against skin like prison bars. Blisters bloomed on feet, unwashed for months. His nails cracked, his voice rasped, even in prayer. And yet he endured. Not from strength, but something stranger. Defiance that had no name. Not anger, not vengeance. A thing deeper than both. He did not pray for rescue. He prayed that Edward would look into his eyes and see himself. And in the bowels of the tower, where kings once carved oaths and heretics burned, the ghost of rebellion stirred, not dead, but sharpening. In the private chamber of Winchester Palace, King Edward I sat before a scroll of judgment, his trembling hand hovering above the royal seal. The fire crackled, spitting embers like tiny, angry spirits. His face, weathered by war and time, was pale, drawn not from doubt, but from the weight of necessity. He wore no crown in that moment, only the robe of an aging sovereign who had tasted too much defiance. Before him stood a tribunal of nobles and clergymen, all waiting for one thing: blood sanctified by law. "This man," Edward said, his voice a whisper with edges of steel, "has not merely broken our laws, he has broken the divine order." He turned, eyes wet, not from pity, but fury. Edward had buried a son too soft for rule, lost half his court to whispers of revolt, and now this Scottish spectre still lingered, a man who refused to vanish, even caged. William Wallace, that name was a thorn behind his crown, a scar in his kingdom's flesh. "What would you have me do?" he asked the silence. "Let Scotland think him a martyr." The silence answered, "No." He signed the sentence, slowly, deliberately. as if the parchment were flesh and the ink poison. The decree was not merely death, it was obliteration. He was to be hanged until near death, then emasculated before the crowd, eviscerated while alive, and finally beheaded and quartered. His limbs were to be scattered. Newcastle, Berwick, Perth and Stirling. His head mounted on London Bridge, a crowning emblem of crushed rebellion. The bishop, standing beside the throne, crossed himself, quietly. Edward noticed. "God," he hissed, "has no patience for heretics with swords." That night, the king stood alone on his castle rampart, the Thames dark and swollen below. In the mist, he saw not the water but flames. Towns Wallace had burned, English garrisons left gutted. But more than that, he saw the people, peasants, women, even monks, kneeling in ruined chapels, not to the cross, but whispering Wallace's name. This execution would not be punishment. It would be erasure. He whispered to the night. He wanted to be remembered. "I'll grant his wish." And so, the seal was pressed, the decree dispatched. The machines of cruelty groaned into motion, and in the tower, Wallace shivered, not from cold, but from the distant echo of fate sharpening its blade. August 23th, 3005. The morning broke like a wound. Low clouds smothered the London skyline, casting the city in a bruise-colored haze. It was not the smell of bread or chimney smoke that filled the air, but the metallic scent of soaked ropes and something older, fear disguised as ritual. From the tower gate, they dragged him. Not walked, not escorted, dragged. William Wallace, shackled and starved, was tied to a wooden hurdle. His body, too weak to stand, was lashed down like refuse. The cart jolted with every rut in the cobblestone, each bump grinding his spine into splinters of pain. Flies swarmed around him, drawn not only to blood, but to legend. Londoners poured from their homes, their children hoisted like offerings to the altar of spectacle. Vendors shouted above the screams, selling wine, meat pies, tokens etched with the hammer and gallows. Men jeered, women sneered, yet beneath it all pulsed something quieter, an unease, the trembling sense that cruelty was not justice, but reflection. He passed the alehouse where, a year prior, men had raised cups in his defiance. Now, they turned away. He passed the cathedral where priests once cursed him. Now, the bells rang, not for prayer, but performance. Along the route, soldiers kept the crowd back with blunt-ended spears. The order was clear: he was to suffer all the way to Smithfield. Every jolt peeled back flesh. His lips were split. His fingers, once calloused from sword and soil, twitched without rhythm, as if trying to remember freedom's touch. Above him, the sky turned a lifeless gray. Below, the mud ran slick with horse dung and blood. At one point, a child leaned in and whispered, "Is that him?" Her mother yanked her back, muttering, "Don't look at monsters." But Wallace was no monster, nor martyr, not yet. He was something more dangerous. He endured, eyes sunken. He scanned the crowd, not to plead, not to provoke, but to witness. Every face, every sneer, every tear. He wanted them to remember this. The screams, the silence, the crack of bone on stone. He locked eyes with a young boy near the scaffold, barefoot, blue-eyed, and in that brief connection, something passed. Not a word, not a look, but a seed. Rebellion never dies. It changes faces. As the cart came to its halt, Wallace lifted his head barely, painfully, and mouthed a single word: freedom. No one heard it, but something did. Smithfield, that cruel theatre, fell into a hush, not reverence but anticipation, the kind that curdles the stomach. The scaffold loomed above the crowd, like a gallows-born altar. Ropes swayed gently in the breeze, as if eager for a neck. Wallace, still bound to the hurdle, was unfastened with all the care given to livestock. His legs buckled the instant he was upright, muscle too wasted to hold rebellion's weight. Two guards gripped his arms, not out of mercy but to display him like a beast before slaughter. A herald stepped forward, unrolling the decree. His voice rang sharp, rehearsed. William Wallace, found guilty of treason against His Majesty King Edward, enemy of the crown, disruptor of divine peace, shall suffer death by hanging, disembowelment, and quartering. The crowd answered with a roar, but not all cheers. There were gasps, silence, even murmured prayers. Wallace was led to the noose, each step a crucifixion. The rope, rough hemp, dark from earlier use, was slung over the scaffold's beam. They did not mask his face. This was not execution. This was spectacle. The crowd had come to see. They slipped the noose over his head. His jaw clenched, not from fear, but the sheer animal effort of will, of dignity. His breath came shallow. Blood trickled from his mouth where he'd bitten his cheek to stay silent. The executioner yanked the lever. Wallace surged upward, then dropped with a crack, his body convulsing as the noose bit deep. Legs kicked, arms spasmed, his chest heaved for air that refused to come. Eyes bulged, turning red with broken vessels. Urine darkened his tunic. But this was not to be his death. Before the black closed in, before mercy's cold hand could take him, they cut him down. A groan escaped him, not of pain, but of stolen peace. He lay twitching on the planks, the crowd's noise swelling again. Some cheered at the near death, others averted their gaze, unsure why the sight stirred sickness instead of satisfaction. The priest assigned to give last rites stepped forward, but was waved away. No salvation, no final words, only agony, measured and meted out like coin. Wallace coughed blood, and in its spatter he saw visions of glens untouched by empire, of voices crying freedom, of the dream that refused to die. The rope had failed to silence him, and the worst had yet to come. A hush fell across Smithfield, not the reverent silence of prayer, but a suffocating stillness, as if the crowd itself sensed it had wandered into a ritual too old, too dark to be fully human. Even the birds, ever-present scavengers of gore, retreated to the spires. Wallace lay gasping on the scaffold, a man suspended between life and death, his body a battlefield, his mind flickering like a dying flame. But they would not let him drift into oblivion, not yet. The executioner stepped forward, a man more butcher than soldier, cloaked not in royal colors but in grease and gristle. His tools were wrapped in black cloth, objects of surgical cruelty, not swift dispatch. He removed a small hooked blade and held it up to the crowd. Some cheered, others winced. Then he knelt beside Wallace. Guards forced his legs apart. Somewhere in the crowd, a priest turned away. Wallace did not scream at first. His body jerked, his hands clawed at the planks. But it was not the pain alone that shattered him. It was the sound. The crowd erupted in applause, their cries gleeful, children clapping as if at a puppet show. He bit down hard enough to crack a tooth. The executioner worked slowly, with gruesome precision. First the testicles, then the penis, removed in one jerking pull. The blood poured thick and hot, soaking the wood. The man stood and lifted the severed flesh for all to see. Triumphantly, mockingly, a nobleman near the front turned pale and wretched. A woman covered her daughter's eyes, but it was too late. The image had seared itself into the minds of all. Wallace's breathing became ragged, staccato gasps through broken teeth. But his eyes, glass though they were, remained open. He would not give them the finality of collapse. In the square, something shifted. Some began to question what they were witnessing. Others doubled down, shouting curses through forced grins, desperate to belong, to believe this was justice, that it had to be. But the air had changed. The laughter felt strained, the triumph hollow. The executioner tossed the severed parts onto the brazier, where they hissed and crackled, smoke curling skyward like an offering. Wallace did not scream. Instead, a strange calm settled over him. Not peace, not forgiveness, but a clarity as sharp as steel. They fear not my sword, but my silence. His body was broken, but the idea of William Wallace defiant, unyielding, was now beyond their reach. And they had two torments left to try. Blood pooled beneath the scaffold, thick and congealing. The brazier hissed beside it, hungry, relentless. The air had changed, not just foul, but wrong, as if the day itself recoiled from what was unfolding. Even the wind had stopped. William Wallace lay motionless, his body a ruin, breath shallow but stubborn. And still it was not over. The executioner returned with a longer blade, curved, gleaming. He did not speak. He did not need to. This next ritual had no need for language. It was older than... Two guards pinned Wallace's arms as the executioner knelt again. Without ceremony, he plunged the blade into Wallace's abdomen, deep, deliberate. The crowd gasped as the skin split, flesh yielding with wet resistance. Wallace's mouth opened, but no scream came. Just a low, choking sound. Less pain, more disbelief at the body's refusal to die. The executioner cut upward, opening him like a sacrificial beast. Intestines slid forth in coils, steaming in the cold morning air. The wound was obscene, too wide for mercy, too slow for death. His organs were pulled out by hand, each one shown to the crowd like a page torn from scripture. The liver, the bowels, the stomach. He remained conscious. A brazier waited beside the scaffold. The executioner tossed the entrails into the flame, one by one. They sizzled, hissed, turned black. The smell, sweet, rancid, unforgettable, washed over the square like a curse. Some in the crowd wept now. Some turned away. A few still cheered, voices cracked, desperate to hold on to the illusion of justice. But the spell had weakened. The spectacle had overstepped. Wallace's body twitched. Blood streamed from his abdomen in sheets. His face was white, speckled with ash, yet his lips moved. No one heard the words, but they saw them mouthing something over and over. Forgive them? No. Freedom? Yes. Even now, gutted, defiled, bleeding to death, he whispered freedom. Not as demand, not as plea, but as prophecy. The sky above Smithfield darkened. A crow circled, but would not land. The executioner hesitated. Just a flicker. He had done this before, dozens of times, but this was different. This man, this pile of ruined flesh, was still defying them, still breathing, still seen, and what remained to be taken could not be burned, nor carved. It was his spirit, and it was beyond their reach. Smithfield had become a cathedral of violence. The scaffold ran slick with blood and ashes, the brazier's fire now dimmed, as if sated. Yet Wallace still lived barely, but undeniably. His chest rose and fell like a dying drumbeat. His entrails gone, his manhood burned, but his eyes still open. The crowd, once frenzied, now stood in uneasy quiet. The executioner did not speak. He had moved beyond words. What followed was ritual, familiar, monstrous. He raised the final axe. It was not a beheading in the clean, noble sense. It was not meant to be swift or reverent. Wallace's head was to be taken with the same cruelty as the rest of him. Deliberately, the axe came down. The first strike landed above the jaw, off-center. A spray of blood fanned across the boards. The second cracked bone. The third finally severed sinew and spine. His head rolled across the planks, stopping at the base of the brazier, eyes still wide. The executioner lifted it by the hair, turned it to the crowd. It was not a face twisted in fear. It was calm, a kind of peace not born of mercy, but triumph. He had endured the unendurable. What more could they take? The crowd fell silent. But the execution was not yet over. The king's decree demanded a message, and flesh would carry it. Wallace's head was reserved for London Bridge, but his body, his limbs were for the corners of empire. The executioner's assistants brought forward the horses and chains. They tied each limb, arms and legs to a different steed. 4 horses, 4 directions. Then they cracked their whips. The limbs tore from the torso with wet pops and arterial sprays. One arm hung briefly by skin before snapping free. The legs came away ragged, the bones visible in jagged stumps. His torso, headless and gutted, remained on the scaffold like a cursed altar. Each limb was wrapped, sealed in tar, and sent away. To Newcastle, where it would rot on the gate. To Berwick, where children would point and ask why. To Perth, where it would swing in winter winds. To Stirling, where rebels would leave flowers beneath it. His head mounted on a pike above London Bridge, leered at all who entered the city, mocked by guards, pecked by crows, but never forgotten. 3 days it remained untouched by bird or rot. Some said even the scavengers knew the flesh of Wallace was sacred. They did not destroy him. They scattered him like seed. The body of William Wallace was gone, dismembered, burned, scattered to wind and stone. His head watched London Bridge like a severed oath. His limbs hung from gates like cursed relics. His name was forbidden in court, mocked in taverns, whispered in ruins. And yet he did not die. In the misted glens of Scotland, his ghost bloomed. It rose not from grave but from memory, from the quiet rage of widows, the scarred hands of peasants, the kneeling prayers of monks who dared not speak his name, but carved his likeness in shadowed corners. Children asked why his arms hung from towers. Fathers answered, "So you know what freedom costs." But some spoke differently, because England feared his soul. In castles, lords slept uneasily, dreaming of a rider with burning eyes and torn limbs, riding through English fields, not with vengeance but with remembrance. A deathless flame licking at the doors of King Edward I died 2 years later, in a war he could not finish. His bones were buried beneath stone and scripture, but his victories turned cold. Scotland remained unbroken. Robert the Bruce, once Wallace's rival, once a betrayer, took up the banner Wallace could no longer hold, and when he fought, he whispered the name like armor. Wallace. The man was gone, but the idea, that brutal, unkillable idea of a land unchained, of a soul too wild to kneel, spread like plague through the isles. Bards sang his story, not with glory, but with grief. A sorrow so fierce it circled back into strength. His face, reimagined through centuries, grew not softer but sharper, etched in stone, bled into banners painted onto blades. England had tried to carve a warning into his flesh, but what they made was legend. Even the scaffold where he died was burned down within a decade. Struck by lightning, they said. Some believed it was God, others believed it was Wallace, returning not as man but as storm. Today his limbs are dust, his bones lost. But step into the mist of the Highlands and listen. Hear it, that distant thunder. It's not weather, it's not war, it's the echo of a man who would not yield. A man who died screaming nothing because his silence was louder than any crown.